Let me start with saying that FASPE, the organization that I'm working with, our team has been very privileged, has been very grateful for working with Tectonic Theater, with Moises, Amanda, of course also with Rebecca from the museum, for quite a few years, I want to say 3-4 years, and it has been extremely stimulating and enriching just to have that possibility to contribute that bit that we could contribute to this. FASPE is an organization that focuses on the perpetrators of the Holocaust. FASPE is an organization that explores the complicity of the professionals and takes that as a starting point, as you heard earlier, to think about questions of professional ethics today. So what we share, of course, with Tectonic Theater is the belief and the significance of Auschwitz and of the history of the Holocaust also for the 21st century. That being said, I'd like to start with acknowledging how, as Yehuda Bauer once put it, in many ways, of course, the Holocaust has become I think he called it a ruling symbol of our culture. And what he meant by that is, of course, that to some degree, things might be changing in the next few years and decades, but so far, of course, the Holocaust is very present, is perhaps even omnipresent still in at least certain parts of the world, and hence also very often is being referenced, the past of the Holocaust is being referenced and distorted in the service of presentist aims. So again and again, of course, we have examples of how, because of that abuse or use, depending on the perspective, very often we are missing the deeper, more complex meanings, and the history of the Holocaust becomes a tool of manipulation, of coercion, being instrumentalized. For me, this play illustrates in the most powerful way that the Holocaust actually defies any kind of easy packaging into neat moral lessons. And for me, the play also invites us to resist the temptation to make the Holocaust manageable or having it confirm pre-existing norms that we don't need to focus on the Nazi crimes for. And I think if we accept that invitation, what we've seen the last couple of hours here is also how Auschwitz, of course, as a site, as a history, as an event, raises profoundly unsettling questions about our society, about the human condition. And the moment that we allow ourselves to be confronted with Auschwitz, with Zola-Hütte, and not just turn it into a metaphor for lessons to be taught, then of course we end up with a very different situation. Matthias Heil once wrote, what makes this so difficult is that Auschwitz in many ways meant the collapse of all faith in the capacity of civilized society to instill humane values. So where I would like to take you for the next minutes is to find a different approach to what was on these men's and women's minds. Is there a way to get closer to how this was possible, how these people were willing to participate in it, and how these people that we've seen here were embedded in European society, in particular, of course, also German society. So that's the undertaking in many ways. Can we find ways to get closer to the minds? Not only see the faces of the photos, but try to at least get a little bit of a sense of what was driving them. Reflecting on the Höcker album, I would say two things stand out for me. And that is the tragic ease with which abnormal crimes were committed by fairly normal people, and who were no monsters, as we also heard. And secondly, also, how we have so many examples of perpetrators who continue to see themselves as good people, as morally intact people. And in the play, this is also expressed. I'll just read you 2 sentences. Höcke and many of the other top brass of the SS genuinely believed that they were doing historically significant work. So it was worth photographing and documenting. And then Rebecca Elberding answers, I wonder if that is how they got through it, the people in the photographs, by compartmentalizing, by focusing on the detail so they don't have to think about what they're doing. And then Judy, the director of the museum, answers, I don't think they needed to compartmentalize. They felt that they were doing the right thing. That this was the moral thing to do. And this is for me a very important platform or point to start also to think about what scholars over the last 10, 20 years have told us about the ethics of Nazism, which almost sounds like an oxymoron, right? But this is, of course, very much is about, and the key notion, what they tell us is, we are so tempted to start on the assumption that all of this was possible because of, how often have you heard this, the collapse of ethics or the absence of morality. And there is increasingly an awareness among scholars that this is perhaps not about absence, but much more about a specific ethical system that made these crimes possible and even motivated it. This might be irritating to some of you, and then just let's work with that irritation for a moment. I think it's safe to say that the intellectual and ideological roots of Nazism, of course, were manifold and complex, but we again and again see how it centers around moral and ethical terms. Honor, loyalty, decency, camaraderie. My honor is loyalty is the motto of the SS. And of course, how to differentiate between morality and ethics is very controversial, and when you start to Google it, you'll find a lot of contradicting definitions. So I'll have a very simple one just for now, and that is, of course, that people, at least quite often, describe morality as the whole of the current norms and values existing in a given society, and ethics then being the critical reflection and evaluation of these norms and values. We sometimes find it the other way around, but that's also not so much the point, right? But just as one way of working with it. And where I want to take us today is, what can we learn? How can we get a better perspective by following that approach to try to understand the moral structure of a society that made these crimes possible? So there's both a history of ethics that asks what kind of ethical norms and values are shared at a society at a given point of time, and how they play themselves out in terms of individual behavior. And then there's obviously one that is more interesting for us, and that is, what's the history of Nazi ethics? How did Nazi scholars write about ethics? How are ethics communicated in the educational system? What kind of values? What ethics are transported, are learned in mass organizations and in the army? And first and foremost, of course, what role did ethical moral norms and values play in the preparation and legitimization of persecution, violence, and mass murder? This obviously very much also taps into a broader trend among historians, among many of my colleagues, who emphasize the cohesion, the consensus, the support, the enthusiasm within the national community, or to be more specific, the Volksgemeinschaft, right? The community of the nation, the people, the Volk, and not so much the totalitarian aspects of something being enforced top-down. The way that I want to approach this with you, and that's of course why you see this screen coming in. I mean, you thought you went to a theater show, now you get a screen, right? Is we want to try to get to one of the sources that actually, and we have quite many of them, that couple killing and ethics. Again and again, and I'm just going to claim this for now because I can't give you all the proof right now, we'll find statements by the perpetrators, by those who were complicit, who emphasize how the killing was an unpleasant task that somehow conflicted with one's own humanity, but it was in overcoming one's own qualms, doing the necessary killing, that one's ethical quality manifested itself. Of course, as so often, we always find the destruction, the murder defined as self-defense. That's something that we find in many genocides. But there's one particular source that I want to share with you and also discuss with you, if we can do this in this big group here. And that is an excerpt from a speech by Heinrich Himmler. And I know that we kind of go to the top of the hierarchy. That's, of course, a little bit problematic. It would be nicer if we could have more the Höcker people, right, of this kind of middle management, but that's not so easy. But from Himmler, we have a few more things. Himmler, I don't know if I just can assume that everybody knows who he is. He was probably number 3, 4, 5 in terms of power in the Nazi regime. He was the head of the SS, in other words, Höcker's boss, right, all the way up. He was the head of the German police. In short, he was the head of everything that in Nazi Germany was defined as the security apparatus, which of course meant mass murder suppression, persecution, camps, etc. So this is Himmler. And Himmler was so fond of himself that he got many of his own speeches either at least stenographed and written down, and many of them even recorded on wax master plates. So we actually have 132 of these speeches recorded in archives. And the one that I want to listen to with you for a moment is from October 4th, 1943. It's a speech that very often is known as the Posen speech. Is that something that some of you have heard before? It's very often, or let's say regularly used in basic Holocaust education to show, see, the government knew what they were doing, right? That's normally the main purpose of that speech, but there's more in it I hope we can explore together. It's a speech that Himmler gives in front of our 92 high-ranking SS officers who have come from all over the Reich to a city that today is Polish and is known as Poznan, but until World War II was a German town by the name of Posen. So we have to imagine this room full of 92 SS officers. There's even some speculation that somebody like Albert Speer could have been there, but that's a little bit unclear, the architect of Hitler and the Nazi Reich. So this is in the town hall of Posen. And perhaps I can just ask you to try to remember where we are at the war, right? October 1943 means, of course, we are far beyond Stalingrad. Most historians will say that it's completely obvious that the war is lost, and even that some Germans start to realize that. The SS is an example that's more complicated, of course. And I hope that some of you at least have a rough idea of what the map of Europe looks like at that point of time. We already have 2 fronts. This is before D-Day, but what we do have is, of course, Americans and British and other armies having liberated half of Italy, and the Soviets, the Red Army, also start to liberate larger and larger swaths of Eastern Europe at that point of time. So that goes for Ukraine, for Belarus, for other parts as well. Since the spring of 43, we already have something that is called Sonderaktion 1005, and I'm just mentioning that because that Sonderaktion 1005 was about using kind of penal companies to unearth mass graves and to burn the bodies and to erase the traces, and that's important. So what I would like to do is to play some of this 3-hour speech. I'll only play 6 minutes. 6 minutes. You can please stay. It's hard because we will hear Himmler speak, right? And that's unpleasant, but of course very much also, I think, a continuation of what we've exposed ourselves tonight also with the play. And what I would encourage is, A, of course, if there are any kind of particular questions about the content, we can perhaps just discuss that for a moment afterwards, if there's anything I can try to explain. And otherwise, I would just love afterwards to have a little bit of a conversation with you, what you take out of this excerpt that tells us something about norms, morality, ethical references. Where is there some aspects that get us a little bit closer to, in this case, even the top of the hierarchy in terms of how they talk about ethics and morality. Now, you might have wondered, how are we going to listen to Himmler speaking German? It is a very common excerpt of the speech. You can find it on YouTube, and if everything works out, just pray that the technology works, we will have Himmler's sound, which is okay to understand if you understand some German, and then you'll have the German text and the English translation next to it. Okay? Any practical questions for now? Otherwise, let's try to listen to 6 minutes of Heinrich Himmler and then enter into the conversation after. Don't be surprised that it might be silent at the beginning, and just give you the intro again, and then we'll start.
Reichtümern restlos dem reichsten Staat abgeführt. Wir haben uns nichts davon genommen. Einzelne, die sich verfehlt haben, die werden gemäß einem von mir gegebenen Befehl in der Anfang gab, wer sich auch nur eine Mark davon nimmt, ist des Todes. Andere Hitler haben sich dagegen verfehlt, sind sehr viele. Sie werden des Todes sein. Gnadenlos! Wir haben das moralische Recht, wir haben die Pflicht unserem Volk gegenüber das zu tun. Dieses Volk hat uns umbringen wollen, es umzubringen. Wir haben aber nicht das Recht, uns auch nur mit einem Recht, mit einer Macht, mit einer Zigarette, mit einer Uhr, mit sonst etwas zu erreichen. Das haben wir nicht. Denn wir wollen nicht am Schluss, weil wir den Bacillus ausrauben, an den Bacillus Kraftwerk sterben. Da werde ich niemals zusehen, dass durch das Rauchen nur auch ein kleine Folgenstelle darauf eintritt und sich festsetzt, sondern wo sich eine festsetzen sollte, werden wir sie gemeinsam auftreiben. Insgesamt aber können wir sagen, wir haben diese schwerste Aufgabe in Liebe zu unserem Volk getan. Und wir haben keinen Schaden in unserem Innern, in unserer Seele, in unserem Charakter daran genommen.
Hard to expose ourselves to. Should I start just to ask you if there are any things you'd like to have clarified that were unclear? Yes. So I have to try to repeat the question. So if they were convinced that they were doing the right thing, why did they hide it? Why did they erase the traces? Yeah, good point. We'll get there. Yeah. So the question is, what role did tribalism play in connection with our parallel to anti-Semitism? Yeah.
How much of it is also based upon the death by 1,000 cuts? I mean, since the Spanish Inquisition, Ford was always anti-Semitism. You can go back before that, that's the most famous one. And then there were the problems in Ukraine at the time, there left a lot of immigrants into South America. And by the time they got to this final solution, it was just the next step in all of this. How much of it was 1,000 years ago?
But that's connected with the question of role of anti-Semitism, isn't it? In terms of the build-up, so to speak? Yes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just a quick footnote. We'll touch on some of these things, I hope. I mean, you have time, right? A few hours, so we can. But many of the most important teachers I've had, of course, always made the important point that yes, the centuries of anti-Semitism played a big role, but we should not underestimate, of course, how there's this big switch between older forms of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, that also could be murderous at times and involve pogroms, but for at least centuries, of course, had a very different perspective, and especially when we look at the Middle Ages, it was about keeping the Jews around because they would prove the truth of Christianity, etc. Right? So anti-Semitism has this weird character that it can change over the centuries and then still remain significant. But that's, of course, a broader discussion. But we need to discuss the role of anti-Semitism. And for me, it's also the question about the role of ideology. How do we gauge that in comparison with perhaps other concepts, right? But we'll get there. I was actually not even necessarily just asking for these big questions, but also whether there's something in the 6 minutes that you felt that we needed to clarify before we enter into a discussion of Himmler's perspective here. But if not, that's fine. Did anybody notice a particular aspect in the 6 minutes that referenced morality or ethics? They felt that they were completely moral to kill people that had set out to kill them. So the self-defense notion, right, that I mentioned earlier, yeah? And it comes up, right? Exactly that notion. Yes.
What struck me in that speech is that Himmler sets himself up to be the good guy. I don't usually want to say this, we're never going to talk about this again. It's so embarrassing. We shouldn't be talking about this. Setting it up as if this is the only time he's going to acknowledge this terrible thing that they've done, but they had to do it. And the word loyalty came up numerous times.
Which also is part of a moral category, right? That's an important point. Yes?
I wanted to highlight that I thought it was interesting that he brought up 1916 and 1917 in his original justification. It seems like he's portraying a kind of feeling of being haunted by World War I. And that seems to lead into his sort of justification. You know, the horrors of the past coming back to justify what happened.
And I think that the reference was to 1916, 17, and World War I. And the important thing is, of course, it's extremely important to understand Nazism is, of course, what 1918 meant for them, right? That was this kind of catastrophic, cataclysmic moment that needed to be undone. And that's, of course, also the reference. And then the whole notion about the backstabbing and so on that plays into that. That's a good point. Yes? Please.
What was the role of the church in accepting this kind of policy?
What was the role of the church? Okay, now we have a lot of big questions here. Where I would like to take us just to work with the text, and then we'll try to weave these different factors into it as good as I can. Okay, one last quick comment, and then I want to go to the speech. Yes. Good point. Where I would like to take us is, I think the most explicit ethical reference from me in this text was decency, right? And arguably the key sentences here is, of course, when he says, oh, all these Germans have their Jew and so on, but you guys, you actually know what it means to stand next to 100 or 500 or 1,000 bodies. And what does he say then? And to have seen through that and have remained and remaining decent is a page of honor that never will be written in the history of the world. That's for me the key sentence. And I think we have to at least entertain the possibility that he's dead serious about that concept. That there is an aspect of that we need to erase it, and we need to erase the traces, and there's the hiding, and there's all of that, and the fact that this is recorded, but it's not next day in some newspaper, right? So there's this, we talk about it here, but we don't want the Vatican and Sweden and the rest of the world to have exactly this text, right? We will still send people to try to erase the traces, etc. And for me, the most meaningful way to approach that is to follow the approach that a philosopher, Frankfurt guy called Ernst Tugendhat had made, where he said, let's try to think about ethics not as this kind of one universalist concept, everybody kind of following Immanuel Kant or something like that, but let's actually think about ethical attitudes, perspectives on a spectrum. On a spectrum ranging from more universal or universalist values, which you want to have norms that should be valid for you, the way that it should be valid for everybody so that society can work, etc. So this idea of universalizing and generalizing it, and what end of the spectrum? And then what Tugendhat calls particularist ethics. And what he means with that concept is, very often, groups of people, individuals, societies, work with ethical systems that are only relevant for their community. And it actually does not matter if the other ones don't get it, because they are not us, they are them. So whether the Swedes or the Pope or the rest of the world get it, doesn't matter. We get it. And I think that is, for me, and for many of the people who have used it, one of the key aspects of this speech. To understand the morality and the ethical orientations of Nazi society as a very extreme version of a particularist ethics that we see all the time in human society, as a potential. And of course, it's also something that's very obvious. I mean, I have particularist ethics when I care more about my 4- and 6-year-old children than the children of the neighbor, right? I mean, there's nothing odious about it, but it is that's why it's a spectrum, basically. And that's why the tribalism also comes in, to some degree, because of course, depending on what we exactly mean with tribalism, on the one hand, it seems to be this anthropological constant that always is relevant, but obviously tribalism in a certain version or combined with certain ways of othering and certain connections with violence also leads to genocide, right? So we're still on that spectrum, of course. The question is, of course, whether tribalism as such, and just to have the term necessarily explains anything. Now, the second step that I would like to take with you is the guys that have had me thinking about that, they say something very crucial happened in 1933. And that is that the centuries of anti-Jewish tradition and ideology and church teaching and so on, partially secularized in the course of the 19th century, right, in terms of anti-Semitism as a modern ideology versus a Christian teaching, etc. All of that, for the first time, becomes the basis of a new legal normative system. That is, of course, what these anti-Jewish laws of 1933 and following do. And at the same time, that new legal normative reality also, and that might be even more important, and I just should give credit to a guy called Harald Welzer, who has really helped many of us understand this, historian and social psychologist, also set off a process, almost a social psychological process, where it's not just about throwing ideology around. This is not about publishing books and pamphlets. That has happened all the time. What happens is that you have a radically new norm. And that is you change the set of coordinates of German society at a radical point and say, we belong, they don't belong, but in an existential, radical, normative way that is, absolute. And then the important next step comes, and then this becomes social reality. Because what Germans experience in the course of 33 and 4 and 5 and 6 is praxis, is practice, is everyday social interaction where it becomes obvious that this kind of vague ideology that I know my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents also somehow believed in, suddenly it becomes everyday lived reality where Jews, the situation of Jews deteriorates, and my situation improves. And that is arguably an important point. So first we have a set of norms that is a radical redefinition of belonging, and then a social and psychological dynamics that happens in the course of the 30s that eventually will make things acceptable and seem normal that would have been judged completely out of the question in the years before. So a German finds himself, herself do things in 36 or 1941 or 1943 that that person would barely could have imagined just a few years earlier. And that's what I find so powerful about the play also. That we have this moment where somebody is a bank teller and then he organizes genocide and then he's a bank teller. Right? That should give us pause that these processes are possible. And it, of course, partially has to do with the fact that, in other words, it might make sense to think about particularist ethics. B, that there's something like the transformation of ethical orientations is possible. And that's perhaps the point where I should end, because I also don't want this to make it much longer than and take more time of the evening. We should also keep in mind that, of course, ethical orientations are full of ambiguities and self-contradictions. I don't know if you ever thought about that, but it's so obvious that we have a tendency to describe other people in essentialist terms, right? He or she is XYZ, a murderer, etc., while, or a thief, that's a better example. So somebody is a thief while I just do something because of the circumstances, right? So, in other words, and in that kind of interesting self-contradiction and willingness to shift these kind of contexts, we of course see again and again that what happens when we build our own ethical universes is that people, as scholars have called it, build normative reference frames. And within these normative reference frames, things we do make sense to us, have meaning. And that's, of course, the crazy, but also extremely important, and in many ways also challenging thing for me to look at the history of Nazism and the history of the Holocaust also 60, 70, 80 years later, is that potential, basically, that it's possible to create those frameworks and to create meaning so that people end up being involved in things that you would have never imagined that would be possible before. And I think that's, for me, also the connection with an aspect that comes up again and again in the play, and where I think that perspective on, in many ways, the ordinariness of these people who are involved with that really stands out. So again, also from my side, a big thank you to Tectonic, and thank you also to La Jolla Playhouse. Thank you so much.